Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mug Up with BB&C. My name is Kayla Wilson, and I'm your co-host today. With me, we have Carmel Ingebretson.
Hi.
Today, we're really excited to talk about limited entry permits. Our guest today is Glenn Haight. He's the commissioner of the Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission. And we also have Dr. Rachel Donkersloot here. She is the owner of Coastal Culture Research. So, hi, Glenn and Rachel. How are you? Welcome
Great.
to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Could each of you just introduce yourselves and share a little bit about your connection to Alaska commercial fisheries? Maybe Glenn, I'll start with you.
Sure. I was born in Juneau and graduated from high school there. Went off to college, got a couple of business degrees, and came back in '95. Worked with the Department of Community and Regional Affairs. That was back when the state had a department focused on rural issues, and got a job working with the state in the CDQ program. And so that was the first exposure I had in Western Alaska. Got to go out and see it, and it's so much different than Southeast, right? So much different. So quite an eye-opener. I think I got to Dillingham in maybe 1996 at a BBDC board meeting in June. I remember Robin Samuelson coming in and saying, "Just got my first king. I'm going to have it tonight."
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. I think Harvey Samuelson got to chew me out a little bit as the bureaucrat in the room. So that was refreshing. Good experience. Great to meet folks there. And got out to other villages in Western Alaska and got some sense of what it's like. It's not like where I was from in Juneau. Later on worked as a fisheries development specialist with the Department of Commerce. And it was there that I started to track these trends. And they had been going on for a while, but you could see in rural areas in certain parts the permits were leaving. And so as a fisheries development specialist, that seemed like something that I should work on. And I mainly worked on the thinking about the educational side of it, getting people geared into it. I didn't think much about limited entry until later. I did a few other things, worked for the Alaska Sea Grant Advisory Program. That was a lot about working with fishermen. Did the Board of Fish for about 8 years, helped run it. More recently, 2022, taken this role as a commissioner with CFEC, and this issue has been front and center.
Yeah, so I was born in Idaho, southern Idaho, and my mom came up to the job fair as a school teacher, a young school teacher with 4 kids. And she came back home, and I remember she said, "The first place that calls back, that's where we're going to move."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. It was all planned out. And it was Naknek. Naknek was the first place to call back.
Nice.
Awesome.
And they said, "We've got some teacher housing for you behind an inn." And she's thinking like a New Heart Inn off of TV, like a B&B type inn, and it was the Red Dog Inn.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
So I remember we all landed there on August 8th, 1988.
Wow.
Yeah. So I grew up on the banks and the bluffs of the Naknek River, kind of watching the fishery happen, and especially in the 90s. And the 90s were super tumultuous. We had a strike, which was kind of like a core memory for me because it was just such a heated time in the community. And then we had crises in fisheries. We had poor runs, we had poor prices, and that all kind of left its mark that really wouldn't be felt for me for years later, because at the time, I wasn't really thinking much about why things were the way they were, about why outsiders and non-locals dominated the fishery. I was just I didn't even know, I just thought everything was normal and that there was nothing unique or special about that place. But years later, as I went to college and I kind of got some perspective on things, and I started to think about like how history and culture and governance can shape places, especially places like Bristol Bay, that eventually kind of shaped my interest in life and really my career path, and started to lead me towards some of the questions we're probably going to be thinking about today. So that's the short version.
Wow, awesome. Well, I'm not going to lie, this topic I don't know a ton about, and I'm sure our audience is so excited to learn more. For listeners who may not be familiar, what is a limited entry permit and why were they created?
Yeah, let me see if I can do some of the origin story on some of this. Of course, I'm reading about it. I didn't live it. But just even starting with statehood in 59, a lot of the pressure on doing that was to try to get some more control over the fisheries for fishermen and move away from canneries, right? And federal management of salmon was a big problem. So that was a big push for statehood. And in the 60s, there was attempts by the Alaska legislature on a couple of occasions to really kind of Alaskanize the fishery. And those failed miserably in court. Didn't hold up. They were violations of the Constitution. The second lawsuit that lost in the 60s cited our Constitution, Natural Resources, Article 8, Section 15. It said there's no exclusive right of fishery. Basically, you can't control a fishery. A person can't just have access to it. So that needed to be amended. The courts said, you have a provision in your Constitution that prevents you from doing this. You can't do it. So in 72, there was a voter amendment to the Constitution that allowed for the state to limit a fishery for purposes of conservation and also to create economic stability for fishermen and those dependent on it. So that opened the door for limited entry. 1973, the legislature created the Limited Entry Act, which formed the commission, which started in late 73, went through 1974, having meetings and developing application processes. And so once 1975 rolled around, they were actually awarding permits. And so in a fishery like the Bristol Bay drift fishery, there's currently 1,800 permits. There's a maximum number. They set a maximum number. And then people would apply, and there was winners and losers. But at the end of the day, you had permit holders, and only people with permits could fish in those fisheries. That's sort of the origins of it. Things to point out about it. When they designed this, they designed it as an owner-operator industry. Right? So they wanted the person who controlled the permit to fish. They didn't want it getting leased out. And there was also a perspective that if the permit holder was the one catching the fish, that they might have more of a concern about the conservation of the fish. So if Fish and Game told them to stop, they would know that they would be able to come back next year and fish. Whereas if it was some absentee fishermen, they might not care as much. The applications were awarded on two things. One was past participation, which makes sense. Right? Did you fish in the past? And the other one was economic dependence. And this was purposeful to try to get the hands into people who they called lifestyle fishermen, but really was your subsistence fishermen, the folks that did commercial fisheries but also lived in the villages that didn't have any other thing to do. So they literally awarded more points if more of your income was from commercial fishing. So a doctor from Bellingham might have a fraction of their income as commercial fisheries, but someone from the Bay might have all of their income from fisheries, and so you could actually get more points for that. They even had a criteria called alternative occupations, like were there other jobs in your area? And if there weren't, you got more points. So there really is some history of us favoring people who live in certain places with certain conditions. So there's a lot of economics built into that. The last thing, this moves into what we're talking about here today, is the permits were freely transferable. So that if I had a permit, I could give it to you, I could sell it to you. It was a way to move it through the family, but also give it some value. And so over time, these permits follow money. And so if there's not original wealth in an area, except for commercial fisheries, once that permit leaves, it can't come back, or it struggles to come back to the village. So that's what you're seeing, this out-migration of limited entry permits from rural areas.
Because they would have to purchase those back at a high price.
Yeah, it didn't happen all at once. It's happened over time, and it's still happening. We're still seeing the permits leave. An older fisherman wants to move and go to a more urban area where there's more creature comforts, things like that. They may not be developing the talent back in the village, or maybe there's no one there who wants to do it. So you lose that lineage over time.
You've been tracking how many permits are actually leaving?
Over time, since the implementation of limited entry, the Bristol Bay region has lost about half of the permits that have been initially issued to locals from the region. And I think what Glenn was talking about is pretty important to point out, that at the dawn of the program, the state tried very hard to create an application process that would favor rural participants, like recognizing the importance of fisheries to local communities and economies. And Nat Hertz, who's a reporter with the Northern Journal, who's done some stories on this issue recently, he describes a conversation he had with Gunnar Knapp, a well-known economist in the state, of it's about kind of the schizophrenic quality of the system, that they went to such great lengths at the start of the program to design it well. And then, bam, well, now we're just going to let the market control entry. Now wealth will become the determining factor in who gets to fish in these waters. So I think it was designed well at the start, but the ongoing opportunity as decided by income and an ability to get a loan and to pay back a loan is very much to the detriment of our village economies and our communities.
And it's sort of a great irony of the program,
Yeah.
where it sought to do something in particular at one point, and then by the way it's just set up, it just sort of moves out. It's not that anyone meant for that to happen, but people did speak to it back in 1973. They were concerned that if you monetize these things, that it was going to leave. There's good things about it, but freely transferable permits, they're easy to administer. Like, the commission doesn't get that involved. Because there was thoughts about maybe having the permits come back to the state and the state reissue them. Well, how do you do that, right? That's a whole different dance. They're easy to move in and out of a fishery, so that kind of helps battle some of the equal protection fights that happened with this in court. But yeah, when you put a sign of value to it, it's going to follow money.
So how much does a permit right now cost to purchase from somebody, or does it just depend?
It depends.
Okay.
I don't have the latest numbers, but I think right now, we'll get in trouble if I'm wrong, but Bristol Bay drift permit, I think, is $140,000. It was up to almost $250,000 just a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
It's not insignificant.
And why do you think people are selling them?
I think there's a number of reasons people exit a fishery, and one is certainly aging out and just the physical demands of being able to fish and wanting to. But the others, which we've struggled with for decades now, is these types of programs, and it's not unique to Bristol Bay, it's not unique to Alaska. Everywhere in the world that has implemented this type of a management system based on transferable permits is dealing with these types of challenges, right? Because these types of programs disproportionately impact certain types of fishermen. It's young fishermen, it's rural fishermen, low income, small scale, and often indigenous fishermen. So they create not only these high barriers to entry, often economic barriers, but they also create greater pressure to sell. And that can happen during periods of hardship. That can happen during a bad season. If your boat breaks down, if you have an old boat, if you can't afford a new boat, you're going to end up selling the permit. The problem is once that permit is sold, we're not seeing them able to come back because that next generation doesn't have the means to buy in, but they've also been disconnected, right? Because you've taken the economy out of the community, but you've also taken the skill, the gear, the knowledge, because that is now in another part of the state and often out of state. So having some sort of mechanism, I think, to support that type of intergenerational transfer and access is really important. And a lot of places have that. Like Alaska's unique that they don't consider proximity to the resource or local access as kind of a priority or a value that they would want to continue over time. There's no provision to support, local access. It's more, if you have, the means, the financial means to get in. So,
Rachel, can you explain how your research relates to limited entry permits?
I mentioned before, by the early 2000s, I was in college with really big plans, and I thought I was going to be a primatologist and, taking on the world. But I kept getting distracted by what was happening back home and the experiences and the decisions that friends and community members were having to make, because at that point the fishery was very much in a state of crisis. And I was really concerned by what I was seeing. I was majoring in anthropology at the time, and what I was seeing, or what I thought I was seeing, was really unaccounted for impacts, right? Because a lot of times we focus on the economic impacts, but there was all these other social and cultural and community dimensions of fisheries that I thought weren't really being explored or understood. And I was primarily focused on rural youth and their life paths, their perspectives, their experiences of place and opportunity, and if they leave, if they stay, like questions like that. And it was through that lens of rural youth that over time I eventually started to pay attention to these types of management and governance systems and how they can align and sometimes misalign with the community dimensions and needs and priorities around fisheries and fishery access. So, we're talking about communities. I mean, Bristol Bay is amazing. Our runs are still healthy, primarily healthy. You have people still living in their homelands. Like it's all a miracle. And then we have a management system that kind of serves to almost sever the local communities from their local resource base. So that was how I eventually started looking at, I don't know, most people might think it's kind of boring when you get into like limited entry and fishery policy, but it's really fascinating because it sets up your choices. It sets up the sustainability of your community. So it was kind of a meandering, very like people-focused way of getting toward what is this policy, how is it working, and might it work better? How was it intended to work and how is it actually working?
Well, your background's anthropologist, right?
Yep, yeah. Social anthropology.
Which is, I think, one of the more interesting science degrees you can get.
Yeah, I think so. I was just fascinated with it all. And then I realized over time that like we still struggle. It's 2025 and like we still struggle both at the state level and the federal level of adequately taking into account certain types of information and certain types of data and certain types of impacts and experiences. And that all gets left out. And then we kind of miss like the opportunity for science to inform policy, which is, the goal. That's, Alaska's very good at science-based management.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's really fascinating. And I think Bristol Bay is really lucky that your mom got the first call from NACNIC.
Kudos to the superintendent for being quick on the call.
That's such a profound impact if you look back at how you guys ended up there.
Changed everything.
And what you're doing now.
Yeah.
How has the system evolved since its inception, and what key findings have led to discussions about revisiting its intent?
Well, I'll just speak to what the Commission's been up to for the last 50 years. Well, the first thing it's been doing, obviously, is limiting fisheries. And it's done over 60 or so. And it's not simple. It's bureaucratic. If someone petitions you, a fisherman petitions you, you research it, you'll hold public hearings, you'll get input, and if it's a go decision, then you have to do regulations, and those get vetted, and then if you finally approve it, you have application processes, and from that, there's litigation. I mentioned the Commission has its own adjudications section. There's probably been maybe upwards of 5,000 internal adjudications in CFEC. Over 550 of those have moved to Superior Court, because if you don't like the Commission's decision, you go further, and over 80 Supreme Court cases have been held over the Commission. So it has a huge history of litigation. There was decade-long battles with the IRS, because once people in rural Alaska had permits, the IRS had something they could seize. And so previous commissioners fought for decades, and they would employ whatever they could to try to protect these permits from getting seized by the IRS. And that was a big fight. They've helped over the years with distressed fisheries. Rachel mentioned in the 2000s when salmon was really doing bad. You saw CFEC's research capacity pick up and try to help where they could. And they participated in efforts dealing with rural permit outmigration. BBNA had what it called a blue ribbon committee back in the mid-90s that CFEC participated with. But really, in terms of the rural issue and outmigration, this has been studied since 1980. I think at the time, Representative Nels Anderson, had Stephen Langdon, an anthropologist, do the study in 1980. And 5 years into it, he was showing that it was moving out. And that's been pretty consistent throughout. Now the Commission does annually a report, changes in distribution of permits, which details where they're leaving rural areas. I was looking through some old notes, and former Commissioner Phil Smith, who was there during the Cooper administration when he wasn't reappointed, he wrote in his outgoing memo, the one thing he wanted to do was address this issue and do something about it, and he wasn't able to, and he was upset about that. But it's been an intractable issue for people at the Commission for a long time. There's just a lot of legal concerns about it over time. If you try to do something that would favor one area over another, would you unravel the whole program? And so people are concerned about that. We can get into more of that later, but that's a simple way of sort of stating the larger concern.
Glenn mentioned Steve Langdon's work, and he has done a lot of work across the state, but also in Bristol Bay in the 80s. And Langdon deserves a lot of credit because he created the residency categories that CFEC currently uses in publishing these annual reports, and that's how we know what's happening. So I think the point I would want to make as part of that is that these residency categories include like the rural local category or the urban local. But this rural local category is predominantly Alaska Natives. These permits are passing from Alaska Native hands to non-Native hands. And I think 2 years ago, Andrea Egley and I'm sure you guys know Andrea well, she's amazing. We published a paper in the Journal of Marine Policy that looked at change in permit holdings among BBNC shareholders in the Bristol Bay salmon fisheries. The rural loss is Alaska Native loss. It's shareholder loss. One of the largest findings, or one of the things that really surprised me about that study, was just the large loss of setnet permits held by women shareholders. In part because the Bristol Bay salmon fisheries, the setnet fishery, is so unique in that it's dominated by women, and women play such an important role in starting kids off young and bringing them into the beach, into those setnet fisheries, and that's where they kind of get their start. It's their first kind of step into the fishery, and it's still celebrated and held up as such a powerful example, but it's kind of a case of like shifting baselines, right? Because that loss is really invisible because those permits are shifting from, Alaska Native women to non-Native men in terms of who's buying them now. So the loss can get hidden if you're looking at like overall, like statewide rural local category. But if you zero in on like these are high value, like cherished salmon fisheries, there's been a tremendous loss, not only in the villages in Bristol Bay, but in Kodiak, down the chain, southeast. Like, this is a shared story of, loss of access to like our most dependent fishing communities, our most vital fishing regions. So
Where is that study, Rachel? Is that online somewhere?
yeah, and I can send you a copy. I can share it with you so you can kind of see the visuals, and yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, and the one that we do annually, changes in distribution of permits, goes a lot of different directions, and so you'll always see that on our website. It's not as focused as what Rachel's doing, but it provides the picture over time.
One of the motivations for us looking at BB&C shareholder participation was a study done in 1984 by CFEC, the Kamali study.
Right.
And it is the first and last time the state of Alaska has ever looked at Alaska Native participation in our limited entry fisheries. And it showed very clearly, like, yes, our permits are leaving Native hands. So we were trying to kind of get an updated accounting of that, but over the past few decades, like, confidentiality laws have changed. So it wasn't an apples to apples. Our best data set was the shareholder membership database, which, Andrea helped cross-reference, and with CFEC files, and that's kind of what we're hoping to accomplish there, was like, well, what does it look like now? Like, has it slowed? Is it shifting?
Yeah, I know Everett is working on a new shareholder survey around this, so I think hopefully by the end of, actually I don't know his timeline, but I think in the coming months we'll have a survey going out to our shareholders.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that survey will replicate the survey that Koniag and Sea Alaska did of their shareholders.
Oh, okay.
So I think it'll be a really interesting comparison across regions, because Dr. Courtney Carruthers, who helped lead some of that work for Koniag and Sea Alaska, she said the data on these survey responses was identical across these regions, to the point that she had to go back and look and make sure she hadn't made an error and put the same data in twice in terms of loss of access and the perspectives on what it's done to communities. So,
are limited entry permits currently achieving the goals they were designed for?
I think in many respects they are, right? I mean, it was to help manage the fishery, and it was create economic stability. I think you've done that. You'll see a more professionalized fleet where you have a lot of permit holders around the state own a couple different permits and be able to fish somewhat year-round and make it a profession. It's in this particular category that we're talking about where I think we're missing a little bit in the natural resource section of the Constitution. In Article 8 section speaks to the legislature's duty to that it shall manage the natural resources for all of its people. It's for everyone. And I think if you look at what's happened, there is cause to say, okay, well, this was a group we were trying to make sure had access to fisheries, and it's kind of going away. Going back to the duty of the legislature, what is it that we need to do to see about changing that? And so that's like a question that's in the air right now.
yeah, I think, Glenn's citing, was it Article 8, Section 15 there, preventing economic distress among fishermen and those dependent on...
Those dependent on them, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can do better there.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some communities it is working well, but in this one, I think the intentions were good, and it's not working out how we thought it would be. And I think people have been trying, in good faith and for a long time to try to address this issue outside of policy change. And to me, it's very clear that policy reform is needed to better meet the objectives. I mean, limited entry was put in time, and it was a time of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And a part of that crisis was the rising number of non-residents coming into Alaska fisheries. And we're still struggling with that, especially in Bristol Bay. I think Bristol Bay is kind of the poster child of that. And it isn't to say, like, there are many non-resident fishermen who have multi-generational ties to the Bay, and everybody should have the chance to experience the Bay. But I think most people who are familiar with the Bay would recognize what's happening in the villages and support trying to find a way to rectify that. And I don't know, we created a visual with G. Laster a few years ago to help communicate kind of what's happening, because our fisheries and our natural resources are supposed to be managed in the public interest and to benefit the citizens of the state. And I think since 1980, for salmon earnings alone, like the state has watched $7.5 billion worth of salmon earnings leave the state as non-resident earnings, you know. And when we look, you know, over the last half century, just this appears to be a one-way track. It's just so hard to reverse the trend without some sort of, you know, institutional change or policy reform. That is very careful, cautious work that needs to take place. But like healthy rural economies benefit the entire state. I think, you know, most Alaskans need to understand that, or maybe need to understand that, but everybody benefits when our fishing economies and our rural economies are healthy and sufficient because they have access to their local resources. Like, it makes
Definitely.
sense.
Yeah, it seems kind of obvious.
Yeah.
So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's kind of talk about the relevance to Bristol Bay. So why should BB&C shareholders and Bristol Bay residents care about limited entry permits? Kind of touched on it a little bit, but anything you want to add?
Yeah. I think it's an important question, right? I mean, obviously, it creates economic stability, right? And you know, when you have that, you can improve your quality of life. I think it's an important question. If I could turn it a little bit, I think it's also important to ask. And we started to go there a little bit. Why is it important for Alaska, for Alaskans, right? Yeah. The first segment, and when you address this question, you start to address the political problem too. Because if you're going to create something that puts pressure on the Equal Protection Act, you have to clearly identify what your state interest is in it. So, I mean, I could see from a commercial fisheries perspective, one thing, it's really helpful to have a lot of allies everywhere. And if you're losing your colleagues in these rural areas, then you're losing their support. I've seen it at the Board of Fish, where Angoon was mainly becoming a subsistence-dependent community, was putting together commercial fishery, anti-commercial fisheries proposals, because it probably just didn't have people in the village anymore that commercial fish that would say, hey, that's really not going to help me. You lose that. I think having a healthy commercial fisherman in Matsu is good, right? That creates some political favor when you need it. One good point is that if the people lose their dependence on commercial fisheries, they may not care about the habitat as much. Right? They may not. They live there, but it may not be as important to them, and so you lose that. So I think there's reasons. There's a lot of pros for the commercial fisheries to think about why this is important for them. For Alaskans, really, I mean, Rachel said it. Like we need healthy economies everywhere because it does have an impact. What happens in Southeast can impact Western Alaska, and the same thing could be said the other way. Mm-hmm. I think there's a powerful message there about why it's important that everywhere we have strong economies, and in these coastal rural communities, it's fisheries. It's the low-hanging fruit. It seems obvious to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I first showed Tim Troll some of the data around shareholder participation, like his initial reaction was, what will happen in a generation? Like if there's, like he brought up the habitat issue, right? And the issue of Pebble Mine. And it's certainly a talking point I have when talking about like fishermen from outside the region who come in, or from outside the state who come in. Because it is, people may want to see this issue addressed, but they're just so, it's almost just like a knee-jerk reaction of fear of change, right? Mm-hmm. So there's support for the status quo because it's stable and it's a known entity. But at the same time, I'm like, if you care about this watershed, if you care about the future of this watershed, you have to care about this issue, and you have to care about these communities, because we need people to be able to live here and make it work for them. I'm not talking about making millions. I'm not talking about unleashing a fleet of highliners. I'm talking about local livelihoods. Like, they want to put up a little bit of fish, they want to catch a little bit of fish. Like, they just, there's lots of reasons to participate in the fishery, and some people are doing it on a much smaller scale than we often see, in terms of like the marketing of Bristol Bay around putting up, the high volume fisheries. But these are just local, smaller scale livelihoods about making it through the next winter, essentially. So certainly, when we're thinking about like why should shareholders or why should, people in the state care about this issue, it's like, it's much more than our local economies. Like, these fisheries are connected to, they're part of culture, they're a part of, the well-being of entire communities. It's about food security, right? David Holland published a paper that looked at the amount of subsistence harvest that is accounted for by commercial fishery permit holders, right? And it's often the permit holders that are harvesting the most, right? Because they're like a key node in that network of providing and sharing, and it's just so entwined with everything out there. So if you care about subsistence, you should care about this issue, honestly. Like, it's not just like, oh, this is the seafood industry over here, and I more care about culture and language and food security, or, you know, whatever. It's
all tied
connected.
together.
Yeah, it's about making these villages work and being healthy and being able to provide for yourself out there. So,
well, what these folks do in the wintertime is they maintain the infrastructure. I mean, look at a town like Naknek, your hometown. I mean, that was the 5th biggest port, I think, in terms of volume in 2022. And can you imagine the lift that would need to happen in order for that to be a ghost town? Then all of a sudden in May, here comes that fleet. So it's really critical, I think, for the commercial fishing industry to have healthy rural economies where people are there all winter long, making sure things are working. Looking at addressing limited entry and making changes to it, it would be complicated. Right? There's a lot of moving parts to it, but I do think that it's possible to do it in such a way that it actually provides a tangible benefit to the commercial fishing fleet as it is now. There's a lot of latent permits that aren't getting fished. There's a lot of permits where the individuals might be fishing but might like to sell. So you could see some consolidation of that, and perhaps permits being shifted to other purposes for those more localized regions.
Yeah. You said latent permits?
Sorry, term of art. Yeah, it's just permits that aren't fished. In every fishery, there's permits that aren't fished. Why?
Yeah, why?
Well, sometimes the harvester can't find a market, but sometimes they're just tired. They haven't sold it yet for whatever reason, or maybe just that year they didn't do it. So there's a percentage, 10 to 15%.
How have permits impacted access to the fishery for local communities and young fishermen?
yeah, I think in 2012, I started thinking about this project in partnership with Courtney Carruthers, a longtime colleague of mine, and it was on the graying of the fleet in Alaska Fisheries, and we surveyed hundreds of youth across Bristol Bay and the Kodiak Archipelago region, and trying to look at some of these perceptions and experiences of the fishery and how we might reduce some of these barriers to entry. Because I do think, I sometimes hear, primarily from people who may have limited experience in small communities in our villages, that well, the problem is that young people don't want to fish anymore. The problem is that young people don't want to work hard anymore. But I think it's a really unfair assessment, because I think we put in a system that allowed for a single generation to kind of decide the future of opportunity in our fishing communities, right? And no one should have that amount of responsibility, because it really is down to these individual permits and what happens to them. And people are making personal choices that make sense for them, but sometimes those personal choices will close off the opportunities for future descendants of these fishing communities. And that's what I think we need to rectify, because I know that there are young people growing up in fishing region, we're talking about the largest, most valuable salmon fishery on the planet. It's insane. Mm-hmm. And there's young people growing up in places like Manicodic and Togiak, and they may not even envision themselves in that fishery or see an opportunity to get in. If you don't have a permit in the family or a family friend, it's hard to even to know, or maybe even have the confidence to how do I get going with this? How do I ask for a crew? How do you make that first step in? And there's programs that are designed to help that, but we really need from the ground up in communities rather than kind of outside institutions coming in. And they're doing great work, don't get me wrong. But some of this, it happens at, on an organic level, or it used to, right? This was just part of, the social landscape of these communities, and there's been a disconnect. So on the one hand, I think you see programs like this, it disconnects people from their fishing past, but it also closes off future opportunity, because once that permit is gone, the economy follows the permit. The opportunity follows the permit. So, Dr. Brett Watson at ICER, he published a great study on, where the value of our fisheries goes, where the benefits go and where they multiply. And it very clearly shows that the benefits of our fisheries follows fishermen home to where they live, not where they fish. So it's not places even if you have a port community like Naknek and Dillingham, the wealth is going to where the permit holder resides. And it's not just like the income, it's crew jobs, and it's also like non-fishing income and non-fishing jobs. Like it just creates this whole economy around the permit. So there's so many reasons our state should like really want to tackle this one, even though it's so challenging. Like there's so many benefits associated with trying to make some minor changes that would have huge, multiplier benefits in Alaska communities for Alaskans.
The mean age of permit holders in Alaska across the states, 53 something. That's younger than me, and I don't know that I could do commercial fishing right now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some 70-year-old folks out there still getting on a boat and working.
Yeah.
So yeah, trying to figure out ways to make it easier for young folks to get involved in the fishery. I think it is a probably all hands on deck. It's not just in the community too, but it really does belong there. But it's all levels of government, whether it's DOT helping try to finance the rebuild of a dock, whether it's part of education, sharpening their career and technical education capacity, which has been developed, which is a good thing. But you've got great organizations like BBDC and Sea Grant Marine Advisory Program. So everyone coming together and trying to get focused on it, I think, would be pretty necessary.
I will say too, so we finished this multi-year study, this graying of the fleet study, and it got a lot of attention. I think we did over 60 presentations. We published 5 papers. We had like PSAs on all the local radio stations about some of the best advice we'd gotten from veteran fishermen about how to be successful and get into the fishery. We won like a national award for it, and since then, I think the average age of commercial fishing permit holders has gone up like 5 years. Like it's only gotten worse, and it's just such a stark reminder. Like no amount of research, no amount of published papers, like it's not just going to fix itself. Like it really is like an all boots on deck, and I think it is super. I am asking like communities to come to the table with solutions that will work for communities, and it's such an unfair ask because it's such a hard, like you're going to need like such a diverse group of folks coming together with like a really technical expertise to try to come up with solutions that will work, that are constitutional, that are politically possible. Like it's really challenging work, but when you look at like the range of skill and opportunity that you need, it is workforce development, it's technical, it's financial, it's tough.
Yeah, definitely.
But what bothers me is that there are kids growing up in the fishery that know how to fish and that are good fishermen and that want to fish, and they can't get in because they can't qualify for a loan. That's
definitely,
that makes no sense.
Well, I think this is a good segue because this is the section that I've been wanting to do for this whole podcast. It's just about looking forward. Like, where is the conversation headed between now and the next legislative session?
Well, that's a good question. I know that I'm available to participate in any effort that people want to put together to look at this. I do think at some point we need to get into the nuts and bolts. We need to have some legal analysis on certain options. We need to think through whether or not they're feasible, whether they're politically possible. But got to talk about it because I look back in 1973 when they passed the Limited Entry Act. It was a governor's task force that put the bill together that went to the legislature, and that legislature, which was, by the way, pretty knowledgeable fisheries legislature, right? There was many people who commercial fished who were in that body. They knew what they were talking about. But they had series and series of committee meetings. They had town halls. They hired experts. They pounded away at it. I don't know that they felt they got it right necessarily, but they did the best they could. And so it takes a big lift, and we need to put some assets behind this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't know if I have much to add, but one of my goals is to just kind of build that shared understanding of, and just to elevate the issue. Like, hey, this is something squarely in your wheelhouse that you guys can tackle. At the same time, there's so many other priorities, currently at the legislature that are, deserving attention. But, Glenn's right. Like, if you look at the number of fishermen who were serving in the legislature at the time compared to now, like we have a tremendous amount of work to do, and just in terms of like elevating the issue so that they know and understand what the issue is, how it's playing out, and how they might start to tackle it. But bringing people together, knowledgeable group together. And they did start with the Alaska Seafood Industry Task Force over the last couple of years. Like, they have started the work, and I just hope that they'll continue it.
Can you guys talk about what strategies or policies are being explored to keep permits accessible to local fishermen?
So I mentioned that growing the fleet study, and as part of that study, we hosted a statewide conference and we published a report that was kind of a global assessment of what other fishing regions and fishing nations have done to address this issue. There's a range of provisions that other places have put into place, and that could be youth permits or apprentice permits or small scale provisions or set asides, like certain types of provisions that can provide or I guess preserve some opportunity for the types of operations and the types of livelihoods that you want to ensure can make it in the fishery today, which right now it kind of feels like these smaller scale operations are getting outcompeted and outcapitalized, and you need that smaller opportunity because people have to start somewhere. So yeah, some of the ideas and some of the tools we've looked at in this ongoing work to figure out, like, what does a solution look like? What do kind of these general categories of solutions look like? There's the trust concept, which tried and went nowhere probably almost a decade ago now. It doesn't seem that long ago.
I'll tell you 2017, 2018.
Okay, so, and that is just like anchoring access to a community or to a type of entity where it can't migrate, it can't be sold away, it can't migrate away, like it's just there for future generations. But it was really controversial at the legislature when the bill was introduced, because it was proposing to allow a non-person to hold a permit, which Glenn talked about this a little bit before, is like the beauty of limited entry is that if you hold that permit, you fish it.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be leased. You don't have lease rates like we see in halibut and sablefish and things like that. And there's been other kind of mechanisms that we've looked at and that we're thinking through around maybe a new class of permit or a new provision, just carving out a little bit of opportunity to address like this very specific problem in our fisheries. Because as fishermen age out, and they are aging out, they're going to exit the industry, and who is in place to take over those permits? And so we're going to see the problem, I think, accelerated as people continue to age out in places like the Bay and elsewhere. But there's only so many ways you can address this issue. So I think figuring out how other places have done it, and then if it can be tailored to our specific needs and our constraints, legal and constitutional constraints, that's kind of where my head's been at lately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's good. That's a good recap. Some random thoughts, perhaps. Some pieces are already in place. There's a couple loan programs that are pretty important. It's really sort of getting someone to the point where they can, there's 3 different general strategies. One is, Rachel mentioned the trust, but it's also a permit bank. That's generally just an organization, not the state, that would be regionally based and moving off permits to individuals who live in a region. There's a permit bank program in Maine, and I can't speak to its success, but it is trying to focus on small boats and moving out certain rights to fish to those folks, just on an annual basis. People talk about looking inside the transfer mechanism. If I'm going to sell my permit to you, from the Commission's eyes, that's an immediate transaction. Like as soon as it's sold, it's yours. Mm-hmm. And let's say you and I have a side arrangement where you're going to pay me for 3 years, pay the permit. If you don't, I might have some other means to come after you, but not through the permit. And so maybe the transfer process could be a little longer. Mm-hmm. Give someone some time to finance that. And the other idea, is just to create maybe a new permit that would be more regionally based, probably non-transferable. Challenges to that, of course, and how you do it is challenged. But you probably don't want to issue more permits. Even right now, there's permits that aren't getting fished. So it might be how do you take the existing pool of permits and carve some out, and that's where it might be an advantage to the existing commercial fishing industry. It might remove some competition, and they're always talking about buybacks needed in certain fisheries. That's just a mechanism where you actually buy permits out of the fishery and you lower the total number. So those are just some of the ideas we hear people talk about, and we've talked about them. And
that would go to the legislative session, or who would make those decisions?
Oh yeah, it has to be put in statute.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, it's not. We don't have the authority to do that. I would think that it would be good to have a platform to really explore these various things. There's other parts about limited entry too that people would like to fix, like buybacks, right? Mm-hmm. It's a clunky statute. Mm-hmm. But if there could be a forum, one that's legislative based, where you can pound away at these things, it may take a session, but it has to. If it's going to happen, it's got to happen. Mm-hmm. It's got to get done. So.
For listeners interested in commercial fishing, what resources or advice would you both recommend?
Well, I mentioned a few of them already. It just depends what you're interested in with commercial fisheries. But of course, the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation is awesome in your region. Mm-hmm. Big fans of what they do, and they've worked really hard on this issue. And in some conversations with them, they feel like they've not succeeded, but if they weren't there, I'm not sure. It would probably be a lot worse. We'll always be a big cheerleader for the Sea Grant Marine Advisory Program. They do the Young Fisherman Summit. There's going to be one, I think, in February, I think. Mm-hmm. It's coming up. So they're great, and they have a lot of resources for people who want to get involved in fisheries. There's loan programs. Our organization really isn't that interesting in terms of overall development. CFEC, it's kind of cut and dry what it does. But it has a lot of economic information on it if people are interested. Of course, Fish and Game is always great. If you do get into the business, pay attention to the Board of Fish. Okay. All right? The Board of Fish can giveth, and they can taketh away. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, if you get a permit, dial into it.
There's some well-established organizations that have been working pretty hard to support young fishermen and to try to address this issue for a long time now. So you should all be relieved that I'm not here to give commercial fishing advice. There's better suited folks, but...
Well, is there anything that you guys want to add? We're kind of at the end of our podcast episode, so any last thoughts, questions? If not, that's okay, but I just want to give you guys one more chance.
I just want to say thank you for, creating some space to talk about this, because I feel like, outside of ANCSA, like, limited entry just transformed our fishing communities in ways that aren't super visible. And I feel like this has been an issue since, we created the problem with limited entry, but there's always more pressing priorities, and time kind of marches on, and this doesn't always get the attention that it needs, in part because it's so hard to try to tackle. There's no easy solution. So just by creating some space for folks to think about this and the role that it plays in shaping opportunity and their local economy is really important.
For those who want to tackle this issue, and at the legislature, the solutions might be complicated, but the argument is simple. I really think it's about economic development and opportunity for people. That's a simple message, but I think it should resonate. And commercial fisheries is complicated in and of itself, and it's intimidating for people to jump into. And so if we can make a strong case for really tackling this issue with those that are familiar with it and understand it, but give them the simple argument for why it's important, I think that's something we want to do.
One way to think about this, too, is that, I don't know if you've read Village Journey by Thomas Berger, but, have you read that, Glenn? No. It's a great read, but one of the points of the account that he lays out in the book is the potential risk of what might happen had they not prevented the sale of shares, Alaska Native Corporation shares, to non-natives, right? In the early 1990s, that was going to potentially happen. Limited entry was the cautionary tale there. These villages had already experienced limited entry. They'd already seen the flight and the loss of limited entry permits. And they knew, people were advocating to prevent that because they knew what would happen, because people face the pressures of the cash economy in villages in different ways. So we should think about the loss of fishing rights like you think about land and allotments and everything else that, you hold dear in places like Bristol Bay. And it's not just industry, right? It's your fish, it's your land, it's your home. So I don't know. I just wanted to mention that, but
yeah, definitely. Well, thank you both so much for coming on the podcast. I think you're right, Rachel, just making a space to make this, it's a serious issue and a serious conversation that needs to be had, and I'm glad that we're having it. You guys are both so smart and knowledgeable. I'm so glad you guys came on the podcast. You made a topic that may sound kind of boring or maybe complicated, but you guys made it so interesting. I loved how you guys talked about the history what if somebody wants to get into commercial fishing, like what are some resources. So we'll include all the resources that Glenn and Rachel talked about in our podcast episode. But thank you again for coming on. This was a great topic and a great conversation.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And can't forget about our listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate each and every one of you. If you like this podcast, be sure to give us a follow on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. We will see you next time.
For millennia, Bristol Bay has been a part of us. Wherever we travel, it remains home. From our elders to our descendants, we are connected through a shared promise to protect our home and our native way of life. For today, tomorrow, and every generation to follow. Time marches on, but we remain one Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay Native Corporation, always more than a corporation.